So if I could start, Kaylee, would you kick it off with the first question? How does the passing of Ireland's climate bill affect how climate change should be reported in the mainstream media?
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks very much for having me. So as Brendan said, I have been the editor of Green News since 2020. I was previously a reporter there. So I got into climate reporting in about 2019. So John has many more years on me of experience. So just want to disclose that for sure before we start. So in terms of how the climate bill affects how we report on this, I think this provides us with a framework, and carbon budgets are going to be really crucial about how the media reports on this. And I think making sure that as many journalists as we can understand how carbon budgets work to the best of their ability, because it's going to be the backbone going forward. I think also another thing, and I'm sure we'll elaborate on this as well going forward, but another thing that I think would be important now that the bill is passed and how the media report on it is we have a climate bill, but lots of advocates and lots of politicians, TDs and senators were not happy with the bill as is and said that it did not go far enough. So in terms of the coverage, I think we need to keep in mind that yes, we have a climate bill, but there's also voices who said that there was lots and lots of room to improve. So I think it's going to be important to include that reporting as we go forward. That would be my first thing. John, what do you think?
Yeah, I would certainly second everything you've said there in opening, but I think as well, what's been missing, and certainly from the time that I've been at this, which is about 14, 15 years, what's been missing is that we've had this episodic approach to climate reporting. So when the circus is in town, like yesterday with the IPCC, then everybody descends on it, and we get some traction and so on, and you get this outbreak of unreasonable optimism, and you think, you know, we've turned a corner and we're making progress. I had this exact experience in 2007, for example. There was a huge uptick in media, and it didn't fade away instantly. It stayed for some time. And the difficulty really is, how do we translate that into, if you like, where climate is part of the media landscape? And I think that's presumably what we're really here to talk about tonight. Does the climate bill passing help? Absolutely. Up until now, we were floating in a bubble. And I would say as well, and this is pretty obvious, but the most important people in journalism aren't humble environment people like us. They're the top of the food chain in every media organization are their political reporters. And the political reporters in my book, and I've talked to a few along the way, haven't really engaged with climate because, first of all, there hasn't been a legislative framework. So their attitude is, it's just a bunch of opinions. It's a kind of a horse race, everybody jockeying for position. And also this weird idea, and I keep coming across it, that the climate and climate legislation is a green issue. And therefore, let's say we're pushing or we're promoting or we're passing a bill. Oh, that's good for the Greens. What the hell does that mean, right? So I'm hoping, maybe again in my innocence, that one of the consequences of having legislation on the statute books is that it reprograms our political press to begin to see it as a given. Therefore, it's not a sectoral interest. I just got to get out of this idea of the climate or environment being a sectoral interest and a political advantage to one party, a political disadvantage to another party. So I know we're speaking in a quasi-party context this evening, but you take my point, I hope, that we've got to get beyond that. And my hope and aspiration is that having climate legislation on the books will re-engineer the way the news organizations approach it. Now, this I don't think it's going to happen by itself. My great fear, of course, is it's going to fall off the agenda again, but I'll save some of my thoughts on that for a little bit further in. But that's just a quick opener anyway.
Just in terms of that, is there, because it's in law, is there a bigger emphasis on RTE than other media organizations? Because RTE is a state body in essence.
On that, just briefly, my understanding is no. There is no statutory framework that RTE has to operate within covering climate. Now, interestingly enough, that very idea, not just for RTE, but for all broadcasters, was included in the JOCA report, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action report in 2019. One of their proposals was that we introduce a broadcast quota along the same model as the Irish language quota and the news quota. And that, of course, they didn't mean for RTE, they meant for all licensed broadcasters. Because in Ireland, of course, to broadcast, you need a license. It's unusual. You know, you can produce a newspaper or magazine. That's all in the free thing. But if you're on the airwaves, you need a license. So the JOCA report proposed that all licensed broadcasters, which is pretty much all of them, would have a legal requirement to have X percentage of their coverage dedicated to climate. Now, I think it's a great idea, but that particular idea apparently went to die in the woods and hasn't been seen since. So, so no, it wouldn't just apply to RTE. Sorry,
Yeah,
Katie.
and I would second John on that, like, nor should it. Like, across the board, everybody is failing covering this issue. It's not just RTE.
No.
So everybody needs to significantly up their coverage. And I'd agree with John. I think it's a good idea to have a certain quota hit of how much coverage it is.
Yeah. I would say as well, just briefly, there is a fabulous model in place for this since March of this year. Sky News UK launched a thing called the Daily Climate Show in early March. Now, I hope that everybody on this podcast tonight has seen it or is aware of it. If not, that should be your takeaway from tonight. It's on twice a day, Monday to Friday, 6:30 p.m. and 9:30 p.m. It's really good, right? I mean, what they do is they place climate at the center of the story. So the presenter is a climate presenter, and then she interrogates the political correspondent, the financial correspondent, the foreign correspondent, and basically makes them kind of go through their paces to climate-proof legislation, new policies, business plans. And it is like taking the sort of the news telescope and inverting it, because normally climate is squeezed in the very end. It's an afterthought. Here, it's actually placed in the middle. So if RTE or any of the broadcasters in Ireland wanted a model for it, it actually is there and it works. I'm guessing a good few of us have seen this, yeah?
Yeah, no, very much. And I think that sort of thing of where the world is a climate change world,
yeah.
The context to almost every story is against that backdrop. We're almost in a car where the brakes have failed, and you keep needing to say that the brakes have failed with regard to economics, with regard to health, with regard to housing, with regard to almost every issue. There's resource or carbon involved in it. Just on that first question, does anybody want to ask a question? Michael Ewan, your hand is up.
Sorry, my camera isn't working for some reason. Apologies. No, I think the points that Kaylee was raising there earlier on about the political background to this is really important. There are obviously a lot of people who thought we didn't go far enough, but equally there are a lot of people in government who think we went far too far, and they are the ones who we're going to have to watch out for, and the reporting space they get in the media over the next number of months, because there's going to be a big battle between departments. When the Department of the Environment comes up with it, when the plan comes out on what each department is supposed to do in terms of their commitments to reducing carbon outputs, there's going to be an almighty row and an almighty war going on between the departments, and then we'll see how the media deals with that particular story. I think that's going to be a real problem for progressive people within the country trying to get the right things done. I think we need to be prepared for that battle, because it's going to be very, very dirty and serious.
Cool, thanks, Michael. Michelle, did you want to come in there?
Hi everyone. I'm up north here of the border. So I was just wondering if there's something along the lines of what the BBC is supposed to do, where they have to have some kind of balanced reporting in inverted commas. So if there's like say 99% of people and experts agree on one thing, they have to find somebody who can talk on the complete opposite thing, even if it's total rubbish. So that sort of skews the argument all the time, because they say on the one hand there's this, but then this guy says that. So people don't know and say, oh well, I don't know what is really the truth here or not. And so it turns it into an opinion, rather than all the experts think this, but Joe Blogs down the road thinks this. So that's just as valid, which is clearly rubbish. So I don't know if that's a general thing in the media down the south, which is it's not really helpful.
Yeah,
just wondering.
I have a first crack on that if I could. I was speaking to a reporter from Primetime earlier, and we were just talking about this issue. And I think the understanding now is that they don't do that anymore on climate. But that was a problem that persisted for a number of years. And that there's a technical phrase for it. It's called bias imbalance, where you actually embed bias. Now, I remember being on a panel discussion on Virgin TV a couple of years ago, and they decided to balance it. They had 3 of, quote, us, and then they had John McGurk as the contrarian. So that was 3-1. But of course, how it worked is every time one of us made a point, he answered it. So the 50%, sorry, the 25% of the panel got 50% of the airspace. So we ended up basically back in the same situation. So that was about, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know if Kaylee's experienced any difference, but I'm certainly personally getting a lot less of that, right? And if I do get an opportunity with, say, well, I won't name names, but there's 1 or 2 broadcasters left, I generally make my excuses and leave, because it's really a waste of everybody's time. It's also a waste of your kind of emotional space, to be honest. Just wears you out. Okay,
Hayley,
I haven't. I have the radio appearances that I've done. I've been the only speaker, so I haven't been in a situation where I was like speaking in almost a debate style or anything like that. What I will say is I've noticed, as someone like who's consumed Irish media for a long time, both as someone from the outside and now working within media, I think the conversation has changed, I'd say maybe over the past year and a half, because normally what it used to be was that they would have like someone like John on or working in the climate sphere against like someone, usually like a farmer, either part of the IFA or a smaller farmer, and it would just become like, you guys hate each other, go. And it was a really like kind of tired narrative that was just kind of like people would butt heads, and then like it was kind of seen as like, oh, they're having a fun fight, and isn't this like so entertaining to listen to? I think that's kind of changed recently, of now the presenter is like able to bring challenges to the other person who's on with the climate person, just from my own experience of listening in the past year. I don't know if you find that, John, but I think it's gotten slightly better in that sense.
Well, I think I had a hat trick of Michael Healy-Rae interviews on News Talk recently. 3 like breakfast show, three times in the space of, I don't know, 2 weeks. It was mad. You think there wasn't a single other TD in the Dáil.
Yeah.
This is the crazy thing, that if you take that extreme position, the media go to you like a magnet.
Yeah.
And this is a huge problem. There's a lot of other voices in the Dáil who I never get to talk with or debate with. What the tendency is to go to the extreme. Now, I hope having me on the other side doesn't mean they've gone to the other extreme, but I hope not. But the tendency is, as Kaylee put it, what they're looking for, and researchers will say this to you, after the call, oh, that was great air. What they mean is that was a great fight. Now, I'll be honest, like I said, maybe I'm just worn down by it. I'm not that interested in going on and having fights with farmers or with TDs or anybody else. I'm far more interested in, let's see if we can problem solve this, because, we're all in a boat. The boat's got a hole. Maybe we concentrate on fixing the hole.
Yeah,
well,
it just feels
John.
like a really dated thing.
If I can just to wrap up on this thing, I've just 2 more hands on this first question, then we'll move on to the second one. Oliver, if you want to come in.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I it's just some thoughts on this first one and questions around it. So, to my shame, apologies, I wasn't aware of the recommendation of Jocko for kind of broadcast quotas, and I just wonder what people think about what influence a broadcast quota would have on online media and newsprint, and then also if it's just a quota, how would we avoid the kind of issues that were just discussed about the false balance and the great air, when in fact it's an emergency we want to communicate and facts around the emergency.
Yeah.
Cool. Do we want to take that up in the second question with the regulatory issues? Blahin, if you want to come in.
I think Colette had her hand up before me. If she wants to come in.
Sorry, Colette, I have a big black spot on my screen and you're behind it. Colette.
Oh, thanks, Brendan. Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing that really irritates me is the business reporting and the economics profession. And I don't know if you can actually describe the economics as a profession. because they've been following completely wrong theories. So I suppose the question then is, how do you actually challenge that when we've been, brainwashed into thinking market forces will solve things? We don't actually have to think about how we allocate things. It'll just happen naturally. Money can't be touched. How we develop the concept of money, and of course bankers are worth ridiculous amounts of salary, and someone in retail or cleaning up after us is essentially worthless, even though during the pandemic we've been shown that actually they do way more important stuff than a lot of other people. So I suppose that's just from the point of view of media, how do you actually break down all of these barriers in a sense, which is fundamental to why we've gotten ourselves into this mess in the first place, I think.
Can I just say, I agree with you about, there's one thing about economics that I'm actually like itching to say, you say that drives me crazy, is you always hear, like, particularly in business sections or economic sections of coverage, it's like, it's going to cost this amount of money to do this, and it's going to be very expensive. What is hardly, if ever, covered is the cost of inaction. And it is wild to me that is not included, because as John and everybody else here knows, like, the cost of inaction is far, far, far greater than efforts needed to decarbonize. And that's something like, I'm from the United States, as you can hear probably in my accent, and Bernie Sanders did a budgetary oversight committee hearing on the cost of climate change. And he had David Wallace Wells there speaking. And I think, like, kind of more of that kind of coverage. I don't know how much coverage that got. I watched the hearing live, but I think those kind of conversations just need to be had more and covered more, because it's a huge, huge gap, I think, in how we talk about it.
Just to add briefly to that, I'm delighted that we want to talk briefly about economics and economists, because it's something that prior to my engagement in this area, I knew nothing about. All I knew is that the people who seem to know money, therefore we all tended to sort of defer to them. And in the media, you defer to economists the way maybe we once upon a time we deferred to the clergy, right? They have that sort of secular clerical role. Now, you may have heard of a guy called William Nordhaus, right? He's known as the grandfather of climate economics. Now, he won the 2018 Nobel Prize for Economics. Now, the Economics Prize isn't a real Nobel, because economics isn't a real science. But leaving that aside, Nordhaus won it. And in his Nobel presentation, which you can look up online, he described a 4 degrees centigrade world as, quote, optimal, right? In other words, anything keeping temperatures below 4 degrees would cost too much. But at about 4 degrees, we can let it run to 4 degrees because that's optimal. Now, to me, that's all I need to know about neoclassical economics and climate change. It is a cult, a dangerous cult. Now, to balance that, there are younger, more progressive economists, Stephen Kinsella from UL comes to mind, who aren't members of this cult or do not appear to be members of this cult, who are actually engaged with the physical science of climate change. Because the problem, as you know, with economics, and we had a huge problem in this country, by the way, with a former economics professor, a guy called Richard Toll, who was based in the ESRI. And he was a so-called climate expert who had a lot of influence on other people, shall we say, in the climate policy field. Now, Richard, to say that he's off the reservation would be putting it mildly. He recently got involved in a Twitter discussion where he described a 10 degrees centigrade temperature rise as something we can adjust to by going inside and switching on air conditioning. 10 degrees centigrade. And it brings back my point that there is a cultish element to this. They're completely not engaged with the science, with the reality of climate change. But unfortunately, some of those people are actually quite influential. They're still regarded. Now, I would like to think we're moving away from those kind of people getting airspace. But again, I don't want to take away anybody's reputation unduly here. I could list a number of other economists who are extremely regressive, who continue to spin, as Kaylee put it, this fallacy about the costs of climate action, while refusing to engage with the staggering costs of inaction.
What you're sort of saying is, well, economics is the objectives of economists. Like particular economics has a particular objective. So climate economics would have the objective of environmental outcomes. And when we talk about two sides of the story, it seems with economics, we've been getting one side of the story, and it's not even a scientific story. So it's not a hard science. It's very much a policy decision area. Bláthín, do you want to come in there? I'm just going to take Bláthín as the last on this one, and then I'm going to move to question 2.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Actually, both Colette and Katie obviously read my mind, and that's exactly what I was going to bring up. In a society that's based on continuous economic growth and unending continuous economic growth, it seems the media are very, very reluctant to challenge any. It's always, well, what do you know? It's going to cost the farmers too much, or it's going to cost society too much, and nobody talks about the cost of inaction. So I'll leave it at that. It's already been said what I wanted to say. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bláthín. I'm just going to move to question 2, and I'll just ask John to start off it. Can you suggest any legislative or regulatory changes that would make the reporting of climate change issues stronger and clearer?
Sure. Well, I guess the structure of the evening is kind of fluid. So I think we have touched on, maybe I jumped the gun a little bit by introducing it. The framework exists. JACA, and this again was a joint all-party committee report. They looked at this and they came up with what I believe would go a long way, let's say, towards solving this, which is to put the reporting of climate change onto an actual statutory footing, particularly for the broadcast media. Much more complicated for the print press for obvious reasons of private ownership and so on. But I do think if the broadcast media dramatically upped their game, then you would see if you like, a peer effect there. I was struck last night as I watched the 9 o'clock news, reporting on the IPCC report. Leaving aside the immediate introduction of an IFA representative before the Minister for Climate Action, leaving that little detail aside, the other thing that was fascinating is that RTE had to draft in their political correspondent who hasn't worked in climate change for 11 years to actually explain to the public what was going on. I mean, this is a broadcaster, by the way, with a turnover of 334 million euros. Right? And they literally had to go to Paul Cunningham, who's a great guy, by the way, but he does not work in this field, and say to him, Paul, would you mind coming into the studio tonight and tell the nation what's going on? So that to me is it is staggering. And Paul is very good, as I said, but he got a promotion to political. As I said, environment is this little backwater. Proper reporters, when they grow up, they want to cover politics, and environment is just where the also-rans go to play. So it seems, but obviously that isn't a view that I would necessarily agree with.
Thanks, John. Kaylee.
Yeah, I would agree with John about the JACA recommendation is a great first step. And what I imagine could happen is if broadcast media have this mandate to cover a certain amount of climate, there would be considerable public pressure on privately owned publications to perhaps see a step change that follows that kind of coverage. So I would agree with what John said, but I think another thing that's important to note, as John said, I agree, like the problem is like that it's political reporters are definitely seen as like the coveted position for sure. I think the other thing, and I saw that Marianne East-Hegler, who's a climate writer in the US, tweeted this yesterday during the IPCC report coverage. She said something along the lines of, and I'll paraphrase her, of that, like, there are journalists trying to cover this huge story, like on their own, essentially. And what happens quite a lot in publications and broadcasting, not just in Ireland, but around the world, is that like you have like either one climate reporter, or maybe if you're lucky, you have a team of climate reporters. Like the issue is, as well as like, it's not just like one little beat that you can just get someone to cover all of it. I mean, like I'm an editor with one reporter with me at the moment, and it like it's just not possible for me to cover every bit of climate news that comes in one day. It's so difficult to do. And I think like what we need to see, I'm not trying to talk John and I out of a job, I swear to God, but like what we need to see is like, there's like a handful of climate reporters in Ireland. It needs to be a field that expands, because how can we expect to catch every story or the stories that are really important if like we have such a small pool of people doing it? So that would be something I would really like to see broadcasting and print media and online media do across the board.
Thanks, Kaylee. I'd just say as a background that the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill is going through the Doyle, I think, committee stage at the moment, and that would establish a new media commission to replace the BAI that's already there. So I don't know if there may somebody come in. I'd also just throw out something that I was looking at as to whether or not the Aarhus Convention applies to RTE, and not in the sense of asking them for information about the environment, but does it put an obligation on RTE to provide information on the environment as part of the news, because they're a state body and are in a sense connected to the government. And I don't know if there's anybody who has expertise in that area, but just something that I would wonder about. John Russell, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I actually had my hand didn't disappear. I'll just make a point that it's the story is largely being kind of captured by economics, and I know this is kind of repeating some of what was said earlier on, but it's actually an ecological story with, it's an ecological crisis with climate change as a symptom. And I know that sounds maybe too ambitious, that the media qualifications and the sort of ability of people in the media. I think quite a lot of time our media coverage has come down to the accident of who's there at the time. Like you say, like John was saying, that Paul Cunningham was kind of dragged into the studio. Philip Boucher-Hayes happened to be on Claire Byrne yesterday morning and did probably the best pieces of journalism I've heard. It was an accident, but I think they probably understand that the economy is a subsection of nature. And like people like George Monbiot can put it in a very good context. And how do we I know this is another question, but how do we convince, or how do we educate, or how do we push the media towards a greater understanding of the crisis? It's not an economics crisis, even though that's part of the solution and part of understanding it. It's an ecological crisis, and climate change is a symptom of it. So I don't know if that adds or detracts from it, but that's my view anyway.
But I have a quick crack at that for just briefly, because we've just had a crisis, okay, a really big crisis. In fact, we're still in that crisis, and that, of course, the COVID crisis. And you can talk about all manner of things and NEFIT and all the rest, but something that struck me as completely obvious is that one of the first things that the government did was, well, first of all, they realized that the media was in trouble financially because the COVID crisis caused a hit on the advertising revenue of all the media outlets. So the government went to their sack of cash and set up a fund and started buying huge amounts of advertising space on television, radio, newspapers, right? Now, they didn't do it as a charity act. They did it because they needed to persuade the public to accept some very difficult choices, some things that 2 years ago, if you'd said, there'll be no All-Ireland final, there'll be no this, there'll be no that, this all cancelled, you can't do this, you can't leave your county, people would have said the public will never accept that. Now, a really important part of the public coming to accept that was an integrated, well-funded government communications campaign that ran across all media, but also, by dint of it being in the media, it helped to support the media financially through this difficult transitional period. Because something that we'll probably come up to talk about soon is, for example, is it appropriate for media outlets to be running fossil fuel ads? But there is also a question of how do we give them another alternate revenue source? So this is my very long-winded way of getting to the point that we need to have a media fund, a government fund that specifically uses billboards, outdoor, online, radio, television to actively promote why it is that we're taking action on climate change, and basically a call to national solidarity. Because without this, then pretty quickly we lose traction. And then what happens is the thing slows up and the special interests pick it off one at a time. So that would, to me, would be a huge part of this here, is to lobby the government. And I have been in touch with Catherine Martin about this, given her role in media, but I've had no satisfactory response to date. This is something that Richard Bruton's spokesperson promised me 2 years ago, that we were going to have a big fund in 2020. It never happened. Bruton left the department. And I think it could be a potential game changer, because it would keep climate change, climate action in the media cycle right through, rather than having it simply disappear after every big event like this. Sorry about that long wind.
Thanks, John. Paul B, do you want to come in?
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to say that Facebook, a very interesting point you're making about certain amount of airspace has to be dedicated to climate issues and climate problems. Facebook already have a climate information section in the main part of their page. They also have a COVID information center section. So just people that aren't aware of that, I think some of the social media channels are getting behind the obvious problems that are there with climate. And I think if more like Twitter and the others did support that, it would help a lot get the message out there to the unbelievers, because it's the unbelievers we must bring to our side. That's all.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Michael Ewan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry to come back in again so soon, but it was just that you actually raised an issue there, Brendan, about the Aarhus Convention. It's something that I have done a lot of work on over the last 20 years nearly. So I think the point you're making about it, the convention does require governments to proactively provide information. It does require that in terms of the environment. So it's a very good point. It ties right in with what John was saying about the government putting together a campaign which provides information. So I'm happy to talk about that again to you another time.
Excellent, thanks, Michael. And Dominic.
Thanks, Brendan. I just want to come back to this idea of sort of economics, and I see in the chat there somebody sort of objecting to the use of the word cult with regard to that. But I think this is the rub of the real problem here. And I think what we need to be able to do to convey the message is, you know, most people in their lifetimes have lived in an environment where things like, you know, growth rates were seen as a good thing. You know, economic growth was seen as a positive. They've had daily doses of sort of economists and so on, basically preaching the gospel. And the previous speaker used the word believer. And this is, I do think we live in a world where the majority are in thrall to an economic, basically quasi-religion of economic growth. And I think where we need to move to is spelling out the story, or trying to help people see where that future is going to be. Now, obviously, there's a certain amount of crystal ball gazing in this, and I'm not suggesting that we sort of engage in that, but it's like, if in a perfect world, if we decarbonized tomorrow, you know, how do I get my groceries? You know, it's spelling these things out for people, because unfortunately, most people don't have enough imagination to think these things out for themselves. And you have to remember, they're bombarded by advertising and so on, you know, telling them to go and buy this SUV, and you've got to go on holidays to this place, and all of these very you know, most of the big advertisers are very carbon intensive. And that's what's, you know, you're just inundated with that messaging, and it's countering that messaging and even daring to talk about things like degrowth and things like this, which many of us probably on the call here understand and know are sort of necessary steps. But it's how to sort of convey that to a general audience is a very difficult thing without losing them sort of at the first paragraph, you know?
I was going to say, Dom, on that, because I think that could be a whole evening on that particular topic.
I'd say a week, Brendan. I'd say a week.
I would say we're just coming up to about 20 to 9. Kaylee, do you want to come back in on any of the points raised there?
No, I think everything was pretty well covered there. I'm happy to move on if you'd like to.
Yeah, no, I would just reiterate, and then hopefully, Michael, you'll follow up with it. The Aarhus Convention, I do think there is something there. And I think that ties in with John's because even from a local paper down in West Cork, I was lobbying politicians to spend advertising in order to make up those revenue gaps. But there is definitely a connection between the government, the law on climate, and the R House with respect to information and RTE's statutory position. And I think if I'm right, there was a court case recently where RTE are subject to AIEs, which puts them into that space. And I think it's something that should be investigated. I'm going to go on to question 3. And Kaylee, I'll come to you for this. How can we fund mainstream media in the future so that it is not beholden to climate negative industries, and or should we be banning advertisements that promote the burning of fossil fuels?
I'll speak to the first half of that question because I'm sure John's going to have a very comprehensive answer for the second half and the whole question, of course. But what I would say about funding mainstream media, I think there's a couple different things that could be explored here. I think one thing I notice as a climate reporter is that a lot of times people, both in journalism and outside of journalism, are like, this issue is so huge, I don't even remotely know how to begin talking about this, let alone reporting on it. So I think there needs to be, and I don't know necessarily, like there's obviously scope for debate here, should that come from a government source, but there needs to be like some sort of climate training given in newsrooms. There just has to be. It's going to be the story of the century. It already is the story of the century. We need to have something like that available. I think also like, I think if I'm not mistaken, the BBC is doing something like this. I could be wrong, but I think the BBC are doing something like they're training young people in specific climate reporter roles. So like a traineeship for climate reporters, I think that's a great way of doing it. I think also like reaching out to people who aren't normally working in newsrooms. We need their voices and we need their stories as well. So that would be a great way to incorporate people who are getting into the industry. And I think it speaks to what John was saying earlier about maybe that could also like, you know, show people that political journalism isn't the only coveted field that you can work in. I think it would be good to entice people that way. And then I don't know as well, again, if this scope is maybe something for the government or something else, but I was very fortunate, now this happened obviously pre-pandemic, but to be a recipient of the Simon Cumbers Media Fund. And if you're not familiar with that, it's essentially you apply for it and you get an organization, a media organization to come on board with you and say that they will publish a story. And it's usually done for reporting in other countries. And it is done for reporting in other countries. And so I had gotten a grant to go to Bolivia to cover climate in Bolivia. But then obviously this was in February 2020 that I received this grant, I believe it was. And then obviously pandemic happened. But I don't know, again, if maybe there could be scope for a fund like that, for example, because I think what it comes down to in newsrooms, from my experience and from hearing from other people, it's just this resources, you know, it's people like I was saying earlier, there's like maybe one climate reporter per organization. I could be wrong in that number, but it seems to break down that way. And I think giving people the resources to fund these stories, like I think if you present that as well, that could help for sure, help us see more stories on climate.
Excellent, thanks, Kelly. Yeah, no, there definitely, and there's also a requirement from people in the developed world to understand the implications of what we're doing on the global south and that kind of reporting. I think RTE did some good reporting on it over the last week. John, if you want to come in. Sure,
I think obviously the funding issue we've touched on already. There's undoubtedly a knowledge gap in most newsrooms. I think most journalists will admit that there is a knowledge gap. And as Kaylee said, it tends to be kind of one reporter per news organization, you know, and you have the weird thing that if Kevin O'Sullivan, you know, is at home, is on a day off, Irish Times kind of climate coverage drops by about 60 to 70% or 100%, right? Which to me is it's a strange kind of capricious situation to find ourselves in. And one of your earlier speakers made the point, and I think it's worth repeating, climate, in a way, is the exhaust fumes of an ecological crisis, right? The climate crisis is a byproduct of an ecological crisis, a crisis of identity, a crisis of belonging where we're completely out of whack with the world. That to me makes it a far more interesting story, because the problem with climate reporting is it can end up being quite technical, where you're talking about parts per million and pathways and concentrations. And I think, you know, other than the technical wonks among us, a lot of people find that stuff very dull. So I find that while I entered kind of environmental reporting through the doorway of climate coverage, I've tended to divert to try to talk more about ecology, to try to talk more about ecosystem integrity, because it also occurred to me that if we somehow save the climate while, whatting the ecosystem, to be honest with you, what have we saved? We've saved nothing. So, and I find it very compelling, for example, when talking to people, whether it's on air or in schools or whatever, to talk about the staggering decline of our ecosystems, the extent to which between humans and our farmed animals, 94% of all vertebrate life now, 96% of all vertebrate life now is either by weight is either humans or our farmed animals. That to me, as a reporter, as a human being, is unbelievably emotional. It says far more, in a far more compelling way than 419 parts per million, that we've completely lost it here. And also it's in a way that it's irrefutable, that people can argue about solar cycles and eclipses and all manner of nonsense, but it's really hard to escape the fact that the living planet is dying right before our eyes. And to me, that's the rallying point that the media needs to be focusing on, to be passionate about fighting for life on Earth. And that, by the way, I also think needs to extend way beyond just human life.
I would also like to add to what John just said there as well, of when I was mentioning earlier about the different ways that we could fund this. Like, one thing I would love to see, and a podcast in the United States has done this, called How to Save a Planet, is climate solutions, like that being reported on. I think a lot of times what we see is people, if there's a report that comes out, whether it's the IPCC or another report from a scientific body, like it is, it presents us with the problem. But I think what also I've noticed anecdotally from people who consume my material or who consume news media in general is they always say, I just don't know what the solutions are to any of this stuff, that they feel like that's something that they're really starved of in terms of a news diet. And I think that's something we really need to put more money and power behind.
Just on the second half of that question, banning ads. Now that reduction of carbon is a legal requirement, is there a requirement to ban ads that would push the state into illegality?
Well, if I could take that one briefly, I tweeted this out recently. I call it an idle observation, but I noticed that the weather forecast on News Talk was sponsored by Ryanair. The weather forecast on RTE is sponsored by Glanbia, the dairy company, and the weather forecasts on RTE Radio is sponsored by Grant oil-fired boilers. Now, I don't know what it is about these high carbon organizations that draws them towards wanting to sponsor the weather forecast, but that's a great place to start. This is bananas. I mean, I would be embarrassed if I was RTE to have the weather forecast and buy a Grant oil fuel boiler. It is just like, hello, this is 2021. This is not 1978. We actually understand some of this stuff. You've got to stop doing this. These, I'm not blaming the individual organizations because let's be honest, those organizations, when we change the rules, they'll be simply selling something else. And we need to kind of move as quickly as possible to changing those rules. And by the way, the best way to encourage organizations like Grant to forget about oil boilers and sell heat pumps is if they could no longer access the media to promote those products. We have a model for this through tobacco advertising, right? Tobacco advertising was gradually limited and then eventually a full ban. If you remember, I mean, when I was a kid, the GAA All-Stars were sponsored by PJ Carroll. And in fact, I remember going to the spring show and the horse show and the RDS, and I wondered why all the riders were smoking, like furiously. They were all sponsored by PJ Carroll, and part of the contract is they had to be seen to be smoking on TV, right? So between rounds, they were there furiously smoking. I mean, I'm making a semi-serious point here. The reality is we pushed tobacco advertising away from sponsorship and away from being advertised. And it doesn't mean we banned tobacco products, but we sure as heck banned the ability of that industry to grow itself, right? And we need to take exactly the same approach with fossil fuels. And I think that's something from a campaigning and lobbying point of view. The problem here, of course, is we're saying to the media, we're about to eat your lunch, okay? So we're talking about the media, which is strapped for cash. And then geniuses like us come along and say, we'd like you to have even less cash. So that is a dilemma because, when cigarette companies used to spend a fortune on advertising in the media, you remember the John Player special on all the motor cars, all that stuff, and that was a hit for the media, but they got over it. And I think we need to make sure that we kind of, how would I say, that the media don't feel that we're just taking away, that we're also showing that there's other services and other areas that could replace some of that business. But I do think we need to be pushing for a squeeze to squeeze fossil fuels out. And let's start with the obvious stuff like sponsorship. You know, the RT Claire Byrne show, if I have this right, is sponsored by an internal combustion engine car manufacturer. That's the current affairs program. Now, if I've got the wrong program, I don't believe I have. I don't think that leaves you with a very unpleasant blurring of lines between news and the commercial side, in my opinion. It's one thing to have an ad or a car in the ad break, but to have the show sponsored by a particular thing. And I've had this as well, where I'm about to go into a program, and just as you're coming on, you're hearing some fossil fuel thing sponsored, and then I come on, and there is a lot of uneasiness, let's say, in this, but I'm not sure there's a quick solution either.
Thanks, John. Kaylee.
Yeah, I had like written down on my notes just underneath that question, I just wrote tobacco industry. So I think John has covered a lot of the points, and I would agree, like, you know, Naomi Klein has a whole book titled No Is Not Enough. So just by saying, no, you can't have fossil fuel advertising, like John's right, we need to be able to show that there's a viable alternative. I would not be able to tell you right now on the spot what that viable alternative is, but it needs to be thought about and fleshed out and discussed for what it would be.
Cool, thanks, Kaylee. Paul B, do you want to come in with a question?
Yeah, just a very quick point. I'm looking at an article here because I think John has hit the nail on the head about funding solutions and climate solutions. There's 100 companies that produce 70% of global emissions.
Mm-hmm.
These companies should be fined and sanctioned and their profits taken, and rather than fund them and advertise them, to fund climate solutions. That's what I would think would be a good idea.
Cool, thanks, Paul. No other hands up at the moment. Does anybody else want to come in? John Russell.
Just by way of kind of just adding a few comments, like recently passed the Public Health Alcohol Act, as it is now, is 2019, which you know, there's some interesting learnings from that. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. Now, you know, there was huge lobbying by the various industries, and they find ways of getting around it. One of the interesting ways they find of getting around structural separation in supermarkets is they come up with the zero product, which doesn't actually have to be structurally separated. So the zero product becomes a product in itself, but it also becomes a product that promotes the other products. Because I don't know if anyone, I like a beer. So if I'm in Tesco, I wouldn't drink Heineken if my life depended on it. No offense, but if I see Heineken Zero, it does. You know, I think, oh yeah, I'd like a beer. I'll go get a real beer. So what and they've done this deliberately. It's quite clever. So they will find kind of ways around it. But I think there's a lot of learning from that. There's a lot of learning from the smoking in public areas. I think there's, you know, we never thought we would do that. We thought, you know, the sky would fall in when that happened. It happened relatively smoothly. So sometimes I don't want to sound silly or naive, but I actually think maybe the solutions to this are easier. I'm not saying the solution will be easy by any means, because I've been reading on this and driving myself demented and other people for about 30 years on this. But I wonder sometimes that when we go to this wicked problem, unsolvable problem place, that what we're actually doing psychologically is we're kind of constraining ourselves. And I know this is maybe a larger, more philosophical point, but I actually think the solution to this might actually be a lot easier than we think, but that we've been so, and I want to stress, I don't think it's an easy solution to solve. And I myself have kind of fallen into despair from time to time, every other day, and become overwhelmed by it. But I think the narrative, we need to change our own narrative. We need to And that needs to feed into policy. I think there are positives out of this, and I don't mean economic positives. That drives me completely daft when people say there's opportunities in this for this sector and that sector. Yeah, they are, fair enough. What I actually think was kind of back to something John said earlier on about the ecology, humanity. It's a human rights issue, it's a justice issue, and it's an ecology issue. And I think we need to start telling those stories. And I think Mary Robinson's book tells those stories of actual farmers in the global south, most of whom are women. It tells their stories. Even last night on Channel 4, there was a small feature on the recent flooding in London. And the piece was actually told by one of the residents. And she went around and met her neighbors. And that piece was it was so affecting, so real. It was a micro of the larger issue. And I think those kind of stories, like 419 parts per million, 2050, 2070, 2090, 2100, 2022, it's like a million miles away. But I think once people kind of connect emotionally to something, this is where we need to get to.
Thanks,
the
John.
maths, the stats, and all those kind of things. If it hasn't worked.
We're just coming up to a few minutes before 9 o'clock, so I'm just going to go Dom quickly if you can, and then I'll wrap it up with Oliver Moran.
Yeah, just I just wonder how prevalent, say, current reporting and broadcasting is actually influenced by those advertisers. As you say, when you've got the weather forecast sponsored by an oil company or whatever it is, or a car company, but more importantly, say the news. I know. I mean, Oliver can probably speak to this more because it's actually happened to him. But when you've been on the radio talking about something, but the key show sponsor, it could be seen as being against the key show sponsor. That bit is cut out of the podcast version or something like that. It might happen on the live bit, but you go looking for it on the podcast and it's not there anymore. And whether it's explicit, I don't know, how explicitly these advertisers ring in, saying, we're paying you all this money and here you are promoting sort of the anti-car lobby or something, and we're a big car company or whatever it is. I don't know how much explicitly or how much it's just implicit, a fear amongst the journalists and the whatever that, not to upset their advertisers by and large, So I don't know if anybody has experienced.
I would say it's explicit, Dom, having worked in a couple of places, that it's always an issue. Where the money is coming and what you're writing about and whether the two things go in the same direction. And advertisers don't spend their money stupidly. You know what I mean? Coca-Cola spend, I think it's 3 or 4 billion per year to advertise so that you drink milk. So it's very effective and it's very powerful. Oliver, I'm just going to come to you, and you might as well comment just in general on the evening, seeing as you're really our host for the Just Transition Greens.
Thanks, Brendan. And thanks also, John and Katie. Really, it was fantastic having you, and thanks for your expertise. One of the reasons for convening this meeting now tonight was with the idea of advancing this issue through policy. And so I noticed that John Ewing has just dropped off, who's the chair of the Green Party Policy Council. But there was an idea of advancing it through the Green Party. So what I've been picking up, if I was to take up two kind of points that came out tonight. One is about that JOCA recommendation on broadcast quotas, and then the other is on restrictions on advertisement. So could I just put it out to everybody here that the Just Transition Greens would advance a kind of a high level kind of policy towards the Green Party on that, and then let it go through the Green Party machinations then after that. But would everybody be generally amenable to that happening?
Could I say, I'm not trying to interfere with your process, but could I just say that as a positive step to promote the fund for climate awareness, that would be a positive thing that would get less media hostility because it might give them a few quid. You know, pushing out a thing saying we're going to shut down all your advertising, you know, that's going to hurt. Okay, so maybe you might sweeten that a little bit by saying that, you know, you could push for this climate action fund to put whatever 10 million or 20 million a year into a program to promote, because in my book, unless this happens, this issue is just going to go back into the long grass. Sorry, I'll butt out now.
No, that's excellent. Thanks very much, Sean. And maybe I might put my earlier question again to Kaylee. You know, coming from kind of, I suppose, print and online, like how do you think that would be picked up in that sphere outside of broadcast?
Sorry, you mean like a quota or increase in coverage?
And restrictions on advertisement, and what John also is saying about a media fund.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, again, like we were saying earlier, that broadcast is a kind of different kettle of fish, particularly with RTE, because it's a state body. So I think like, you know, the one that I would imagine that you guys would have more sway obviously with is with RTE and through legislation to that degree. But I do think like seeing, I mean, since Irish Doctors to the Environment, for example, wrote that letter, as I'm sure we're all aware, it gained a ton of traction online, and John was pushing it as well. And through John's own commentary, like we've seen some degree now, like John was saying, like, you know, a lot of times these reports come out and then it disappears, like the degree of coverage. But I think like, you know, if we saw broadcasting public bodies significantly up it, I think there would be pressure that would be then kind of exerted across the board. So I think it's like a way that you could kind of test it and see what it spread, if that makes sense.
Okay, that makes sense. I see Maeve Cody's said yes in the chat. Shall I take it that everybody is in agreement then with a high level policy along those lines?
Just to say as well, Oliver, Michael Ewan is still in the meeting.
Okay, Michael, would you be amenable to accepting that?
Basically, you have until Friday to produce something, because the next policy council is on the 4th of September. So if you want to produce a policy motion for that, happy to receive it. And you don't have to make it a very detailed document, just a short statement of intention, really, and get it in by Friday. 9 o'clock Friday morning, by the way, is the deadline. So there you go. I mean, it's not up to me what goes on the agenda. It's up to you, the members of the party. So I just chair the thing.
Thanks very much, Michael. That's great to hear. Great. I'll work on something like that and get it through our policy channels in the JTG.
By the way, just as a quick aside, probably the strangest sponsorship in RTE, it started last October, is the RTE Countrywide, which is ostensibly their rural affairs program. The Irish Farmers Journal took over as sponsor of Countrywide last October. Farmers Journal are a wholly owned subsidiary of the largest agricultural pressure group in the country. And RTE's, the presenter of that program, is also a columnist with the Farmers Journal. Now, I've made public point about this a number of times, but I'm not getting anywhere. But like, where are we going when you've got the farming program sponsored by a farming pressure group that has constantly opposed climate action?
But also add that rural Ireland is a lot more, including myself, is a lot more than farming.
Yeah,
and it's a very narrow focus.
1.8 million people in rural Ireland, 64,000 of them are full-time farmers, maybe 160,000 are farmers. And yet we hear nothing from the other 1.65 million people in rural Ireland.
Yeah, definitely something worth amplifying. Kaylee, do you want to finish with any particular note or wish?
A wish. I think like one wish that I would like also like to see stop in general when climate journalists or people working in climate are interviewed is like, I saw someone refer to it on Twitter as the dreaded hope question. Just that's something that I really want to see stopped. And that's just my own bugbear. Like that's obviously nothing that can be done through legislation, but I don't know if you guys have noticed, like what happens a lot is like I get asked this, or John, I'm sure gets asked this, of like, what gives you hope? What's one thing that gives you hope? I think one thing that like something that annoys me about that, and like Mariana East-Hegler, again, to quote her, was like, she said, you know, she takes that sometimes when she hears that question, if I'm quoting her right, is that like, it's someone saying, well, you care about this, so you got this. And if you have hope, then I don't have to do anything, right? I think that's Very true, if I've understood her correctly. So yeah, if you're talking to anybody in media, ask them, please stop asking climate journalists the dreaded hope question. That would be great.
Good wish. John, would you like to finish on one thing of anything in importance?
Yeah, well, yeah, don't give me hope. I would agree about that. Absolutely not. Just a quick one. There's a prime timer doing a report on the IPCC report after the 9:30 news tonight, or after the news tonight. So starting at 9:30. So anybody's interested, hopefully it'll be worthwhile. And yeah, that's it. And thank you, by the way, very much for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it. It's been very stimulating. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Well, thank you, Katie Cross, and thank you, John Gibbons. Look, 9:30 after the news, you can catch John again if you want another fill of him. He's been doing brilliant work over the last couple of days. Thanks to the Transition Greens and Oliver Moore for setting up this and putting it together. And thanks everybody for participating and asking questions. And see you all shouty on Twitter in a few minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, John.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Katie.
Good evening, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.